Thank you very much, and it's a real privilege to be here in Paris to share with you some of the experiences that I've had over the years surviving what are today popularly called transformation journeys. I've had the privilege of going through a number of these, and in the last iteration I was the Chief Information Officer of a small bank in New Zealand called Westpac. So Westpac is part of a larger group. I'll give you a little bit of context quickly. Westpac is a group of about 40,000 employees, about 14 million odd customers across New Zealand and Australia. It's the oldest company in Australia and the second oldest, I believe, in New Zealand. And my remit was around the New Zealand arm of the business. Now, before we get into some of the lessons along the way, I think it's quite important to give you a little bit of context as to what the journey was actually all about. In 2015, the New Zealand Bank was an underperforming organization. It was a lazy organization, and yet in the true style of banks was still a very profitable one. And when I joined the team in 2015, there were a couple of indicators that the problem we were trying to solve was in fact not a problem of method. It was not necessarily a problem of governance. It was very much a problem of culture. And when I joined the team in 2015, as I go, I'll tell a couple of stories just to illustrate the experience. There I was, a brand new CIO. I'd been imported from halfway around the world to come and help this technology team get their stuff together. And in the very first all-hands meeting, there I was in my suit back in the day, telling the story of the potential future and to 300 or 400 people in the room. And at the end, I quite hopefully said, "Does anybody have any questions?" And there was a long silence. A lot like now. And then right at the end of that very long and uncomfortable silence, which we all feel the need to fill, one guy put up his hand and he said, "Dawie, I have a question." I said, "Oh, thank God there's a question." "What is your question?" And he said, "How long is your contract?" And it was one of the first indications that the glue to any kind of change that we want to drive, in fact, is not a mechanical glue, it's not a governance glue, it's not a control glue, it is in fact a cultural glue. So what I'm going to share with you over the next 20 minutes or so are going to be some of the observations from this journey, from a previous journey at another large bank, and then a journey at a smaller bank, and what I as a leader in these particular journeys have experienced and seen, and the kind of advice that I would give to anybody who aims to lead a change, to introduce a new style of working, to introduce a new culture into an organization. So how many of us have seen this? We get into an organization, the first thing we start hearing is how management needs to change, management needs to move with the times, management is this, management is that, management is the other, and what we're actually experiencing is a massive trust gap between those who drive our businesses, those who create the value in our businesses, and the perceived enemy being the boogeyman that is management. And the more we dive into the literature around, especially in the agile world, around how to influence and create change, the more this becomes a language pattern that we see and is perpetuated from coaches, from scrum masters, from the various methods that are published, that the enemy of agility, the enemy of change, is management. There was a pretty famous example quite recently of a large bank in the region in which I operate who announced that they were going to do a transformation. And the very next sentence was, "Because we want to get rid of the frozen middle of management." So imagine, in a large organization, 35,000, 40,000 people, as a third or half of your organization sits back and starts looking around going, "Am I management? Am I in the frozen middle?" And it's within our control as the practitioners, as the evangelists of both lean practices and agile practices, to change this particular language, to acknowledge that the kind of change that we try and create in organizations depends very much on us having leaders who understand, leaders who have knowledge, and leaders who can bring that knowledge to the great intent that they bring to work every day to support the kind of change that we're after, as opposed to be the boogeyman and be the enemy. So, a couple of pieces of advice. On a number of occasions, having led or taken leadership teams along to create great and significant change in large organizations, what we tend to do is we enlist a consulting company Consulting company arrives with a pre-printed set of methods, pre-printed set of structures. We implement the change, which means that we reorganize. We shuffle people into new boxes. We throw a book of method or a book of tools at them with some coaches, and the job is done. And then we wonder why, a couple of months later, people are miserable, things are not working, the results are not coming. And most importantly, our leaders don't understand how to drive this organization that we've just created. So one of my first pieces of advice is this, and you'll face lots of pushback, and I know this because I have on a number of occasions, because it feels like we're going slowly, but invest the time to educate the leaders who are going to be the custodians of the organization as it goes on this change and learning journey. Invest the time to land with them the core principles, the basics of what it is that we're trying to achieve. Certainly expose them to as many methods and as many frameworks as you can find. Certainly, put them in front of the various gurus that are around. Put them in front of your respected voices. Put them in front of as many talks and as many YouTube videos as you can. Take them around the world and see the many practices. And most of all, equip them to understand that dogma is the enemy of our learning. And that every framework that they see, every video that they see, and every place that they visit is merely a repository for 100 different solutions to problems that we might come across, and not a pattern to be blindly followed. The next lesson is that in our organizations, especially when we look at them from the top down, a senior leader's urge is to standardize the whole organization so that it's easier for a senior leader to understand what the organization looks like. And what that often does is it drives out the many pockets of innovation and of problem solving and solutioning that are already taking place in those organizations today. So it is that when you look across any large bank, any large industry, any large enterprise, there are going to be people who are trying things that are not the way we do it around here today. And those things will include lean stuff, agile stuff, other stuff that solves the problems that they face in the moment. And the minute we arrive with a predetermined outcome, a predetermined framework or a predetermined method, we are actually quite disrespectfully throwing away all of that learning that those people are gathering by trying things in the heat of the problem. Much more productive then to be going around the organization, understanding what those problems are that people are solving in this slightly naughty, slightly off the edge way, celebrating that learning, incorporating it into what becomes the toolbox of how we do it around here. Because then what's happening is we're respecting everybody and we're creating the method that everybody wants to be working in, not the one that our expensive consultants have brought. And then the choice of that framework. So, have any of you ever been in a dogma fight? Are we a scaled agile organization? Are we a DAD organization? Are we a less organization? And very often these dogma fights break out because we've created coaching cohorts, we've created Scrum Master cohorts from different organizations where these methods are very successfully practiced. And we haven't made it clear that what they are to us is the repository of learning and not the end game. We haven't made it clear that the beginning state is merely the shoe. It's the place where we create the repetitive, simple motions from which we can have the organization learning and solving in ever-creating ways the problems that we uniquely face. So the first choice of method is both important and not. It's important if what we need is to establish the shoe, but it's an obstacle if we establish the shoe with no intention of ever moving past it. Organizations are complex organisms. This little Jenga stack was a fantastic illustration that I quite shamelessly stole from an illustrator friend of mine. That illustrates the fact that very often we change individual dimensions of the organization. We try and change the method, the process, the control, and we forget that the rubber band that holds our organization together is in fact the culture. So anytime we embark on a journey that doesn't have an encompassing focus on how it feels to be at work every day for everybody, all that we're doing is we're inflicting a temporary push, a temporary nudge of one of those blocks, and those are doomed to come back to what does feel comfortable, even if it's not the best day at work. In 2015, we decided that what we would do is we would not do any method work, not do any DevOps work, before we had actually put our team in a room, and for ourselves articulated what a great day at work feels like. So all of you have had great days at work, I hope. Yes, you've all had great days at work. And when you cast your mind back to that great day at work, there are some very clear themes that tend to come out of them. Most often, those are the days where we achieved something unexpected, where it was a difficult problem to solve, a large mountain to climb. It was the kind of problem that we couldn't solve on our own, so we had to collaborate. It was the kind of problem where we needed a lot of different skills, so we had to respect the many voices that came to the table to solve the problem. And yet, when we organize ourselves, we forget that the very thing that makes that collaboration powerful is that experience of having created something greater than the task at hand for everybody in the organization. So it was in 2015 that our departure point was, what does the great day at work feel like? And then we elaborated every single practice to solve a problem that we encountered in the moment that allowed us to feel the way we aspired to feel. Now roll that around a little bit, because that is a pretty strange approach to take. When a team says to us, we are struggling with dependencies, and the first question we ask is not, bring the mechanical tool by which we solve dependencies. The very first question we ask is, what were those experiences we said, what were those emotions we said we wanted to experience in our working day? And then bring the tools that allow us to solve the problem and to experience the fulfillment from the values that we have stated we have. These journeys along the way create heroes. Early on, you'll find people who gravitate towards agile practices, towards the trust and the accountability and the empowerment that comes from operating in a squad where you have all those great feelings, the trust, the collaboration, the value, the greater outcomes than yourself. And you find that they set themselves on fire to the extent where they become the voices, the storytellers of the success of what you're trying to create. And then a couple of years down the track, they burn themselves out. So one of the lessons to leaders is this, is when you create the snowball of change, the rolling ball that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, when you have those great storytellers who get emotionally vested in this new thing that we're trying to create, look after them. Because if you don't, a couple of years down the track, the disillusionment of change taking longer than they would like sets in, and these people hurt themselves. And I'll tell you a story. There was a young lady called Emma in one of my teams many years ago. And Emma, one day at a brown bag session, 30-odd people in the room telling stories, sharing experiences, said, Dawie, can I tell a story? And Emma was quite quiet normally. I said, yeah, sure. And she said, when I was at university, I had my favorite job ever. I worked in a record store. And in that record store, I was surrounded by my favorite thing in the world, which is music. And my job was to introduce other people to my favorite thing in the world. And I was immersed in this thing that I loved above all other things all day, every day. I was like, wow, that's quite powerful. And then she said, but I think I found my new favorite job. And Emma was one of our new Scrum Masters in our organization, one of the champions of our cultural change, one of the custodians of what that great day at work looked like. 2 years later, Emma resigned. And when I asked Emma why she resigned, and she was in tears, she said, because nobody warned me that it was going to get this hard. So remember that when we create the champions of our change, that we must also create the safety net by which we can keep them engaged, by which we can protect them from the evangelical fervor that they might break into in the beginning, and essentially have them smolder for a long time rather than burn themselves out. So we've spoken a little bit about the emotion of the new organization. And one of the other things we often forget is that our organizations run on a whole bunch of meta processes and meta capabilities along the way. We focus on the culture. We create this great new thing that is agile and everybody feels great doing it. And suddenly we put an immense amount of pressure on the parts of the organization that don't understand what we're doing and that don't understand how to support us. Typical examples of this are you heard some of it this morning, our bonus structures, our investment processes, our HR processes, our risk management processes. And if we don't actually focus on creating the right hypotheses and the right experiments to come up with the right way to support our new shaping organization, all that's going to happen is our stack of Jenga blocks is eventually going to topple. For leaders, in the old style of leadership, it was a lot like being in the corporate box at the rugby. Any rugby fans in the room? Yeah? Yeah, Springboks just beat Canada, 66-7. It's a lot like being in the corporate box when you work in a traditional style organization, because there you are looking down upon the game from on high. You're getting your information via the television mostly because you can barely see everybody on the field. People are carrying food across you, you're having a quiet drink, and you're getting all your information at arm's length, nicely insulated from the fact that there is a game going on. In this new world of flow, in the world of high velocity, suddenly we get to the point where our own teams do not tolerate us as leaders doing anything that seems to disrespect the flow and the work and the outcome that they're trying to create. And I'll give you a quick example. About 3 years into the journey at Westpac in New Zealand, I was doing the important banking leader thing, walking around on my phone, and I walked into a meeting room and sat down in the meeting room taking my important call. As I was sitting there taking my important call, there was a knock on the door, and I looked up, and there were a couple of folks standing outside. And when you're an important and senior banking leader, your response is quite predictable. You go like this. And you carry on with your call. When I walked out of the room, there was a young lady standing right outside the door, and she said to me, "Dawie, I'd just like to tell you that the team that had booked this room for their morning stand-up is feeling very disrespected by what you did." I thought, okay, so think about the power differential in this conversation. I'm the CIO of the bank. There's a young scrum master who's just said to me, "You haven't behaved the way that we've all contracted to behave. What you have just done is you have not created the feeling of the great day at work that we have all contracted to have." And how many options do you have when someone does that other than to say, "Take me to the team, let me apologize"? And the lesson here being that as a leader, when you're creating a new style organization, a flow-based organization, you can no longer live in the box and not worry about the consequences of your actions. Nobody is above the flow, and nobody is above the culture of the organization. Early on in that journey, early on in our session today, I told you the story of Jim, who asked me how long my contract was. And often when I tell that story, one of the first questions that comes up was, how long was Jim in the organization after that? And the answer is that Jim eventually, 4 or 5 years later, retired from our organization. And that's because of one of the key principles that we implemented very early. And the key principle was that we can never expect anybody to buy into a vague and distant outcome. All that we can do is we can ask them to ride the bus until the next stop. And at every stop along the bus route, everybody gets to choose whether or not what we're doing works for them, whether it feels authentic, whether it's making their days better at work. And at every stop, they get to choose whether or not they want to stay on our bus. Now, I have never, ever regretted having this conversation with my teams, mainly because 90% of people do feel that new great day at work, do experience the benefit of being able to collaborate and being trusted and all that kind of stuff. But then there are those who don't. And there are 2 flavors. The one flavor are the people for whom this just doesn't work, and they authentically don't feel it and don't want to be a part of it, and that's fine. And the trick as leaders then is to make their exit from the organization as graceful as we possibly can. But then there are the other type, and the other type are the ones that I've regretted on multiple occasions in my career, and these are the ones who are inauthentically supportive of the change that you're trying to implement. These are the people who would upwards paint the picture of how great this all is, and downward create absolute misery for their teams, as the message that they send is, "We are never ever going to be cross-functional. You are never going to ever experience any of this." And the lesson here is that the minute as a senior leader that you see this in your organization, that is probably one of the few times that you have to be authoritarian and you have to deal with it front up and quickly. Because as long as that festers in your organization, other people see it, and all that they can think is, why are all these people having this great day at work and I'm not? Why is my boss keeping me away from this? So in these journeys, it's quite important for us to focus on the importance of why we're doing this. I've been at a number of Agile conferences. I've seen the Agile movement over the years develop and progress. And I have on occasion thought that we speak as if the outcome is to be agile, when in fact the outcome that we're trying to create is highly successful organizations that create value to the market, to the shareholders, and to everybody who commits their daily lives to that organization in equal measure. And that's why when we set the intent for our journeys, it's absolutely critical that we be authentic about why we're doing this, that we be clear about why we're doing this, and that we allow everybody to come into that circle and go there with us. The number of occasions where I've seen the adoption of an agile model or even a lean model with the public intent of one thing, but with the private intent of reducing our headcount, unfortunately are too numerous to count. And I can also tell you that no one in your organization is stupid. They'll figure that out quite quickly, mainly because your true intent is always going to come through in the decisions you make and in the language that you use. At least some of us recognize this particular reference. The last point to this is that when you do go on this journey of changing from an old-style, hierarchical-style organization into a collaborative one, into a flow-based organization, that you have made a choice that is irreversible. At one of our big room planning sessions, one of my colleagues, who is a fairly strong fan of the concept of control, walked up to a squad, and he randomly picked a member of one of the squads that was busy working through dependencies, and he said, "Hey," this is a senior guy, one of the heads of one of the executive team members, one of my colleagues, said to this guy, "Hey, if we decided tomorrow that we weren't going to do this hippie nonsense anymore, that we were going to do our waterfall again, what would you do?" And without blinking, this person looked him in the eye and said, "I would resign immediately." So when you embark on the journey of changing what is the fabric, what is the fundamental structure, organization, and control of your organization, it's a one-way street. You're swimming down a river that only has a non-return valve. And you need to be quite conscious that if you're going to embark on that journey as a senior leader, that you need to stick it out. Because otherwise you're going to let everybody down halfway through the track. So, that was a whole bunch of download. And I'm pretty sure that some of you would like to know what the kind of results were that we saw over the years. So in Westpac in New Zealand, in 2015, these slides will be available, by the way. You don't have to take pictures. In 2015, we had a release cadence. This is for the DevOps junkies. We had a release cadence, a quarterly release cadence, which was, suboptimal. And where they are today, and I say they because unfortunately I have now gone onto a group role. It's not my team anymore. But where they are today, it is a release at will in many cases of the organization. Most places it's a weekly cadence. Some places it's a 2-weekly cadence. The most important part being that the cadence is a choice. In 2015, the team's engagement score, I was reading a great tweet this morning, something about if you need an engagement score to know how your people are feeling, then you're out of touch. Well, I can tell you that being in touch is not a measure that you can play to the rest of the enterprise so that they can get confidence in what you're doing. So an engagement score is actually quite a useful thing. In 2015, there were 500 people who had an engagement score of 53%. 53% is in the fourth quartile of the 700-odd organizations in that tool, and I don't think I need to remind you that there are only 4 quartiles, so it's in the lowest quartile. Within 18 months of taking the approach of creating the experience of the great day at work, that team was in the top quartile and hasn't budged out of the top quartile in 4.5 years. And then there was the economic factors. We created a measure by which we could monetize the efficiency created by focusing on flow and not focusing on project. We created a measure called structural efficiency. This always gets very exciting quite quickly, but structural efficiency allows me to quantify the amount of waste that the data is telling us is in the flow, is in the throughput. In 2015, we measured it for the first time. It was a pure hypothesis that we could measure it, and the measure came back as 23%. Now think about 23% as an efficiency measure when our job is to look after other people's futures. Imagine you went to a broker, an investment broker, and you said, "Here are my life savings, and I'd like you to please create a future for me with these life savings." And that broker's response is, "I'll absolutely do that for you. Thank you for trusting me. The first 76 or 67% or 77% of your money is going to go towards my premises, my car, my holiday, and my staff. And the last 23% I'll invest for you, and your future will be safe." It's one of those measures that once you see it, it's irresponsible to ignore it. So over time, what we did is we used the measure of structural efficiency to guide every change that we made, every iteration that we went through, as we changed the way that we were looking after and creating flow. Today, that organization sits at an efficiency measure of 72%, a threefold increase in efficiency. The final takeaway from this talk is that as a senior leader, these are very hard journeys to go on. They take courage. You saw earlier in Bus's, I think it was in Bus's talk where he mentioned the umbrella that needs to be created between the organization and its stakeholders and shareholders. And when it takes that amount of courage from a senior leader to embark on a journey like this, for us as a cohort of practitioners, of coaches, and of evangelists of a number of different styles of work, of lean and of agile work, we need to embrace those people who have that courage. We need to not vilify the very people whose support and whose leadership we need to create the change that we want to see in their organizations. And on that note, thank you very much for listening to a very short, condensed set of lessons and experiences that I've had over the years, and I'm more than happy to take questions.